Single dad veteran slept on the floor with the triplet babies. The billionaire walked in and froze. The sound of 3 crying babies at 3 a.m. in downtown Chicago would break most men. But Daniel Rodriguez had learned to find strength in breaking, and tonight, like every night since leaving San Antonio, he gathered his triplets close on the cold shelter floor and whispered the same promise. "Daddy's got you." Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy the story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. The Arizona sun hadn't yet painted the Phoenix skyline when Daniel Rodriguez's internal alarm pulled him from 2 hours of fractured sleep. His body, trained by 8 years of military precision and 6 months of fatherhood, moved with quiet efficiency around the cramped studio apartment. 3 cribs dominated the space, second-hand frames with pristine mattresses he'd worked double shifts to afford. "Morning, angels," he whispered, his voice carrying the rasp of too little rest and too much worry. Emma stirred first, her tiny fist uncurling like a flower. Then Lucas, always the loudest, announced the day with a wail that could wake the desert. Finally, sweet Sophia opened dark eyes that mirrored his own. Eyes that had seen too much, carried too much. Daniel's hands, scarred from roadside bombs in Afghanistan and calloused from construction work, moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared 3 bottles. The formula was generic brand, the only kind his food stamps covered, but he warmed each bottle to the exact temperature their pediatrician recommended. Some things couldn't be compromised. The eviction notice on his refrigerator fluttered as he passed. 48 hours. The words had lost their sting through repetition, joining a collection of final notices that painted his reality in red ink. His disability check covered diapers and formula. The part-time work he could manage between PTSD episodes paid for utilities. Rent remained a dream deferred. "We're going on an adventure today," he told the triplets as he changed them, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, a souvenir from Kandahar that worsened with stress. "Uncle Tony says Chicago has opportunities." The babies gurgled and cooed, trusting him completely. Their faith both strengthened and terrified him. They didn't know their mother had walked out 3 weeks after their birth, couldn't understand why Daddy sometimes woke up screaming, never questioned why they slept in an apartment that echoed with emptiness rather than abundance. Daniel packed their lives into 2 duffel bags and a borrowed stroller, each item chosen for necessity over sentiment. 3 changes of clothes each. Diapers for 2 days. Formula for 3. His discharge papers and their birth certificates in a weathered envelope marked "Important." As he loaded the babies into the third-hand minivan, a gas-guzzling dinosaur that wheezed promises of breakdown, Daniel caught his reflection in the cracked side mirror. 32 years old, looking 50. Brown hair that had once been regulation neat now hung limp around hollow cheeks. The uniform had been traded for thrift store jeans and a Phoenix Suns t-shirt with more holes than fabric. But his eyes, those eyes still held the fight. 3,000 miles east, Alexander Sterling's alarm system activated at precisely 5:30 a.m. in his Manhattan penthouse. The automated voice announced the weather, his stock portfolio's overnight performance, and his schedule. All information that washed over him like background noise as he stared out floor-to-ceiling windows at a city that belonged to him in every way except the one that mattered. His reflection in the glass showed what 45 years of building an empire looked like. Silver threading through dark hair, lines earned through 10-hour days and 12-hour nights, a body maintained by personal trainers because discipline was easier than caring. The $5,000 suit hung perfectly on shoulders that had forgotten how to relax. "Good morning, Mr. Sterling." His assistant's voice came through the intercom, professional and distant. exactly how he preferred all human interaction. Your flight to Chicago departs at 8. The Matthews acquisition requires your signature. Chicago. Another company to absorb, another fortune to multiply. Alexander moved through his morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower in his marble bathroom that cost more than most people's annual salary. Breakfast prepared by a chef he barely acknowledged. Coffee from beans flown in from Jamaica that he tasted but didn't enjoy. The penthouse was a monument to success and a tomb for anything resembling life. Original artwork that he'd purchased but never studied. A grand piano that hadn't been played since. He stopped that thought before it could form completely. Some memories remained too sharp, even after 3 years. His phone buzzed with updates from his CFO about the Chicago deal. Sterling Industries was acquiring a chain of homeless shelters. Tax benefits, urban development opportunities, positive PR. Numbers on a spreadsheet that would make him millions while helping the invisible people he never thought about. The irony would have been amusing if he'd been capable of amusement. As his driver navigated toward the airport, Alexander reviewed acquisition documents that would displace hundreds while generating profit margins that would please shareholders. The homeless shelter chain represented inefficiency. Buildings in prime locations operating at losses, serving a population that contributed nothing to the bottom line. He made notes about renovations, staff reductions, operational improvements that translated to making poverty someone else's problem. It was business, clean and simple, the kind of transaction that had built his empire from his father's ashes. But as the plane lifted off from LaGuardia, carrying him toward a collision he couldn't foresee, Alexander Sterling had no idea that in a few hours, efficiency would meet humanity, and his world of calculated distances would shatter against the raw proximity of love sleeping on a cold floor. What do you think about Daniel's strength in facing impossible circumstances? Drop a comment below about a time when love gave you the power to keep going when everything seemed hopeless. The Mercy Haven shelter on Chicago's South Side had seen better decades. Paint peeled from walls that had witnessed 1,000 stories of desperation, and fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullabies over rows of cots that represented the thin line between survival and surrender. Daniel had arrived 3 hours earlier, clutching intake forms that reduced his life to checkboxes. Veteran? Yes. Dependents? 3. Mental health concerns? Leave blank. The intake worker, a tired woman named Mrs. Chen whose kindness hadn't been worn away by years of witnessing heartbreak, had looked at the triplets and broken protocol. We're full, but... She'd glanced around the crowded main room, calculating space that didn't exist. There's a storage room in the back. It's not much, but it's quiet. Better for the babies. The storage room was exactly what it sounded like. 10 feet by 12 feet, concrete floor, no windows, smelling of industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. But it was theirs for the night, and after sleeping in the van for 4 days straight, even this felt like sanctuary. Daniel had spread his thin military blanket on the cold floor, arranged the babies in a protective semicircle around him, and tried to convince himself this was temporary. Just until Tony's construction job came through. Just until his disability appeal got approved. Just until the universe stopped testing exactly how much one man could endure. Emma had been fussy, her cry echoing off concrete walls like an accusation. Lucas had finally exhausted himself into sleep, tiny fists curled against his father's chest. Sophia, sweet, intuitive Sophia, had stared up at Daniel with those knowing eyes, as if she understood they were in a place where hope came to die. "It's okay, baby girl," Daniel had whispered, his voice cracking despite his determination to stay strong. "Daddy's going to figure this out. Daddy always figures it out." But lying there on that floor, feeling the cold seep through his bones and into his soul. Daniel Rodriguez, decorated veteran, Purple Heart recipient, man who'd survived insurgent attacks and roadside bombs, finally felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel before: defeat. Meanwhile, 3 floors above, Alexander Sterling moved through Mercy Haven's administrative offices with the detached efficiency of a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The shelter's director, an earnest man named Patterson, followed behind like a nervous shadow, rattling off statistics that only confirmed what the spreadsheets had already revealed. Operational costs have increased 300% over the past 5 years, Patterson explained, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man watching his life's work dissected. But our success stories. Success is measured in profit margins, Mr. Patterson. Sentiment doesn't pay overhead. Alexander's voice cut through the explanation with surgical precision. He paused at a window overlooking the main shelter floor, scanning the rows of cots like a general surveying a battlefield. This facility sits on prime real estate. The land alone is worth $40 million. These people have nowhere else to go. Alexander had heard variations of this conversation in boardrooms across 3 decades. There was always someone who confused business with charity, who thought feelings had a place in financial decisions. That's not my concern. My concern is maximizing shareholder value. But as he spoke those familiar words, something unexpected happened. A sound drifted up from somewhere below, not the general murmur of the shelter's population, but something specific. Something that made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't experienced in 3 years. A baby crying. What's that sound? The question escaped before he could stop it, betraying an interest that had no place in a business transaction. Patterson looked confused. Sir. The crying came again, not one voice but 3, a harmony of infant distress that seemed to pull at something Alexander had thought permanently severed. Without conscious decision, his feet carried him toward the sound, down a hallway he had no business exploring, toward a door marked Storage, Authorized Personnel Only. The door was slightly ajar. Alexander pushed it open and stepped into a scene that would replay in his memory for the rest of his life. On a concrete floor, lit by a single bare bulb, a man lay curled around 3 babies. The man's clothes were threadbare, his sneakers held together with duct tape, his face gaunt with exhaustion and stress. But his arms encircled those children with a protectiveness that spoke of love deeper than survival, stronger than pride. The babies were clean despite their surroundings. Their clothes, while obviously second-hand, were carefully maintained. Their tiny blankets were tucked with precision that spoke of military training adapted to fatherhood. And in the center of this tableau of poverty and devotion, the man, this stranger who had nothing, was whispering to his children, "Daddy's here. Daddy's always here. You're safe, my angels. You're loved." Alexander Sterling, master of the universe, billionaire who had built an empire from ambition and ruthlessness, who had trained himself to feel nothing because feeling led to weakness, who had spent 3 years in emotional exile because the alternative was unbearable, froze. The scene before him was a mirror held up to his soul, showing him everything he'd lost, everything he'd chosen to discard, everything he'd convinced himself didn't matter. Here was a man with nothing who had everything that mattered. Here was poverty that was richer than all his wealth combined. Here was what Alexander Sterling had been before the accident, before the guilt, before he'd decided that caring was a luxury he couldn't afford. The veteran looked up, and their eyes met across the impossible distance between their worlds. Brown eyes filled with exhaustion and determination met blue eyes filled with recognition and something that might have been shame. Neither man spoke. Neither man moved. In that frozen moment, With 3 innocent babies as witnesses, 2 broken souls recognized each other across the chasm of circumstance and choice. And everything changed. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would go through your mind if you walked into a room and saw someone sacrificing everything for love? Alexander Sterling hadn't slept since the moment he saw those 3 babies curled against their father on the shelter floor 48 hours ago. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel Rodriguez's face, not the desperation he'd expected to find, but something infinitely more disturbing. Dignity wrapped in threadbare clothing, love measured not in dollars but in a father's willingness to become a human shield against the world's cruelty. His Chicago hotel suite, the presidential floor of the Fairmont, felt like a prison of marble and gold. Through the windows, the city sprawled beneath him like a chessboard where he'd always been the king. Now every light represented a story he'd never bothered to read, every shadow a life he'd dismissed as irrelevant to his bottom line. "Sir." His assistant Marcus Chen appeared in the doorway, tablet in hand, expression carefully neutral. "The Matthews acquisition papers are ready for signature. The homeless shelter chain will officially become Sterling property at noon." Alexander stared at the documents that would transform those buildings into luxury condos, pushing families like Daniel's further into the margins. The numbers made perfect sense. $300 million in profit over 5 years, prime real estate development opportunities, tax advantages that would satisfy his board of directors. "Delay the signing," he heard himself say. Marcus blinked. "Sir, the market timing is optimal. Every hour we wait." "I said delay it." Alexander's voice carried the edge that had terrified competitors for 2 decades, but inside he felt like a man drowning in his own success. "Tell them we're reviewing additional parameters." After Marcus left, Alexander walked to his bathroom and gripped the marble countertop until his knuckles went white. The man in the mirror looked exactly the same as yesterday. Expensive haircut, perfectly shaved jaw, eyes like winter steel. But something fundamental had shifted, and he couldn't push it back into the comfortable darkness where he kept all inconvenient emotions. 3 babies. 1 father. A floor that should have been a bed. He'd built his fortune by understanding people's weaknesses, their breaking points, their prices. But Daniel Rodriguez hadn't broken. Even sleeping on concrete, even holding his children while the world crumbled around him, the man had radiated something Alexander had forgotten existed: unshakable love. It terrified him. 15 miles south, in a roach-infested motel room in Cicero that cost Daniel his last $60, the father who'd unknowingly shattered a billionaire's worldview was fighting his own battle against memory and pride. The triplets slept fitfully on the sagging mattress while Daniel sat in a plastic chair, staring at a business card that had appeared in his jacket pocket like a whisper from another universe. Alexander Sterling, CEO, Sterling Industries, written in raised lettering that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly food budget. He'd found it after the encounter, after the man in the $1,000 coat had looked at him like he was discovering fire or witnessing a miracle. After security had shuffled the families out while the rich man stood frozen, something cracking in his expression like ice over deep water. Daniel knew that look. He'd seen it in his own mirror after Kandahar, after Maria left, after every moment when reality proved stronger than the stories we tell ourselves to survive. But knowing didn't make accepting help any easier. His phone, a flip phone held together with electrical tape, buzzed with a text from Tony. Construction job in Milwaukee. Starts Monday. You in? Milwaukee meant leaving Chicago, meant running again, meant admitting that pride was more important than his children's future. But it also meant avoiding whatever that business card represented. Charity dressed up as something else, pity with a corporate logo. Daniel's hands shook as he typed back, "Yeah, I'm in." Emma whimpered in her sleep, and he moved to adjust her blanket, a hospital-receiving blanket from when they were born, soft from washing but still carrying the faint scent of industrial detergent. She settled against his palm, trusting him to keep her safe even when safety felt like a luxury he couldn't afford. Through the thin walls, he could hear other families, a woman arguing with someone on the phone about rent money, children crying, a man coughing with the wet sound of lungs that had given up hope. This was his world now, a place where Alexander Sterling's business card felt like a mockery. But as he looked at his sleeping children, Daniel couldn't shake the memory of how the billionaire had stared at them. Not with the detached concern of someone writing a check for tax purposes, but with something raw and hungry, like a man seeing home for the first time in years. "What do you think, angels?" he whispered to the triplets. "Should Daddy trust a man who probably spends more on lunch than we see in a month?" Lucas stirred and made a soft sound that could have been agreement or gas. Daniel closed his eyes and let himself remember Afghanistan, the morning his convoy hit the IED that sent him home with a purple heart and hands that trembled when he tried to hold anything precious. His sergeant, a man named Williams who died in that explosion, used to say that pride was just fear wearing a uniform. Maybe Williams was right. Maybe refusing help wasn't noble. Maybe it was just another way of running from the possibility that someone might see him as worth saving. But as Daniel tucked the business card into his wallet next to his children's birth certificates, he made himself a promise. He would survive this with his dignity intact, even if dignity was all he had left to give them. 3 miles away, in his penthouse suite, Alexander Sterling was making his own promise to ghosts that haunted marble bathrooms and piano benches where small hands used to create music instead of empires. Tomorrow, he will find Daniel Rodriguez again. Tomorrow, he would figure out how to bridge the gap between wanting to help and knowing how to be human. Tonight, both men would lie awake, thinking about children who deserved better than the worlds their fathers had created. Daniel was loading the last of their belongings into the wheezing minivan when Alexander Sterling's black town car pulled up to the motel like a funeral procession arriving at the wrong address. Through the cracked windshield, Daniel watched a man in a coat that cost more than most cars step onto pavement that had never seen shoes worth 4 figures. "Daddy, hungry," Emma babbled from her car seat, her tiny fingers reaching toward the crackers Daniel couldn't afford to replace once this package was gone. 5 more minutes, Angel," he murmured, but his eyes never left the approaching billionaire. Alexander had rehearsed this conversation during the sleepless night, but standing in the parking lot of the Starlight Motel, a name that promised dreams in a place that specialized in broken ones, words felt inadequate. Daniel Rodriguez looked smaller in daylight but no less formidable, like a soldier who'd learned to carry impossible weight without letting it show. "Mr. Rodriguez." Alexander's voice carried across the 15 feet between them like a bridge neither man wanted to cross. Daniel's hands stilled on the van's door handle. "Mr. Sterling. Fancy seeing you in this neighborhood. Are you slumming, or did your GPS get confused?" The bite in Daniel's voice should have triggered Alexander's usual response, the cold dismissal, the cutting remark that reminded people of their place in his world's hierarchy. Instead, he found himself saying, "My plane doesn't leave until tonight. I was hoping we could talk." "About what? Your tax write-off? Your feel-good story for the company newsletter?" Daniel slammed the van door harder than necessary, and Lucas startled awake with a cry that cut through the morning air like an accusation. Alexander flinched. He'd forgotten that volume, that immediate need that couldn't be delegated or scheduled or solved with a wire transfer. "No. About helping your children." "My children are fine." Daniel moved to the driver's side, but Alexander stepped into his path, not blocking him, just occupying the space between Daniel and escape. Sleeping on a shelter floor isn't fine. Eating generic formula isn't fine. Living out of duffel bags isn't. Don't. Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more threat than any shout. Don't you dare stand there in your designer suit and tell me what my children need. I've kept them fed, kept them safe, kept them loved every single day since they were born. What have you kept, Mr. Sterling? What do you love more than your next quarterly report? The question hit Alexander like a physical blow, but before he could answer, the van's engine made a sound like death rattling in an expensive coffin. Daniel tried the ignition again. Nothing. Again. The starter clicked with the enthusiasm of a broken promise. Son of a... Daniel caught himself, glancing at the babies in the back seat. Come on, please. Not today. Alexander watched Daniel's composure crack just slightly around the edges, the way his shoulders sagged for half a second before military training pulled them straight again, the way his jaw tightened against words that would solve nothing. I can call my mechanic, Alexander offered. I can't afford your mechanic. You wouldn't pay. I would. Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in it. And then what? I owe you. You own me. That's how this works in your world, right? Everything has a price. Everyone has a debt. Before Alexander could respond, a Chicago PD patrol car pulled into the motel parking lot. The officer, a heavy-set man with the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much, approached them with the casual authority of law enforcement in a neighborhood where authority meant survival. Morning, gentlemen. We got a call about a disturbance. Daniel's face went pale. Alexander realized with sudden clarity that a black man with 3 babies and a broken-down van in this part of Chicago was one phone call away from losing everything he'd fought to protect. No disturbance, officer, Alexander said quickly. Mr. Rodriguez and I were just discussing transportation options. The officer's eyes moved between Alexander's obvious wealth and Daniel's obvious poverty, making calculations that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with assumptions. Vehicle registration, he asked Daniel. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the paperwork. Alexander watched the interaction with a growing understanding of how different their worlds actually were. When Alexander encountered police, it was at charity fundraisers and political events. When Daniel encountered police, it was a matter of survival. The vehicle belongs to Mr. Rodriguez, Alexander said, pulling out his phone. But it's experiencing mechanical difficulties. I'm arranging for immediate roadside assistance. He speed-dialed his assistant while watching Daniel's face cycle through anger, embarrassment, and grudging recognition of necessity. Sometimes pride was a luxury parents couldn't afford. Marcus. I need emergency roadside service at the Starlight Motel on South Cicero. Yes, immediately. Yes, I know it's Saturday. Yes, triple overtime. The officer looked between them again, clearly confused by the dynamic but mollified by Alexander's obvious resources and confidence. You gentlemen have this handled? Completely, Alexander said. After the patrol car left, Daniel stood in the parking lot holding Emma while Lucas and Sophia babbled from their car seats. Alexander had created this situation, not intentionally, but his presence had attracted attention Daniel couldn't afford. The tow truck will be here in 20 minutes, Alexander said quietly. The repair shop is 10 minutes from my hotel. We can wait there while they fix whatever's wrong. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, looking at his children, then at the man who just saved him from a conversation with police that could have ended very differently. Why? He finally asked. Why do you care? Alexander looked at the 3 babies, at Daniel's protective stance, at the love that radiated from this small family despite everything trying to tear them apart. "Because," he said, and his voice cracked just slightly, "I used to have someone worth protecting too." The morning light filtering through Alexander's hotel suite windows felt different. Softer somehow, as if witnessing Daniel's quiet strength with the triplets had changed even the quality of sunlight. Alexander hadn't slept. Instead, he'd spent the night researching, using resources that money could buy to piece together the fragments of Daniel Rodriguez's story. The file on his mahogany desk told a tale written in military commendations and medical reports. Staff Sergeant Daniel Rodriguez, 82nd Airborne Division. 2 tours in Afghanistan. Purple Heart recipient. Bronze Star for valor. The official language couldn't capture what Alexander saw between the lines. A young man who'd volunteered to carry the weight of freedom on his shoulders. But it was the final entry that made Alexander's hands tremble as he held his morning coffee. Honorably discharged following traumatic brain injury sustained during IED explosion outside Kandahar. 3 fellow soldiers Kia. Recommended for intensive PTSD therapy and ongoing disability support. 3 soldiers were killed. Daniel survived. And survivor's guilt was eating him alive. Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from his security detail. Subject located at Lincoln Park. Feeding children by the lake. 20 minutes later, Alexander found them on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan. Daniel sat with Emma on his lap while Lucas and Sophia shared the stroller. All 3 babies mesmerized by the dancing sunlight on water. Daniel was singing softly, a Spanish lullaby that drifted on the Chicago breeze. "My grandmother used to sing that," Alexander said quietly, approaching from behind. Daniel tensed but didn't turn around. "Thought you'd be on your jet by now, back to your tower." "The deal can wait." Alexander moved around to face him, noting the dark circles under Daniel's eyes, the way his left hand trembled slightly as he adjusted Emma's blanket. "I know about Kandahar." The singing stopped. Daniel's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Alexander thought he might bolt again. But then Emma made a small sound, and Daniel's focus returned to her, his voice steady when he finally spoke. "Which part? The part where I was supposed to check that alley first? The part where Martinez took my position because I was dealing with equipment failure? Or the part where I walked away from 3 body bags? The part where you saved 12 other soldiers by spotting the secondary device?" Daniel's head snapped up, eyes blazing. Don't you dare try to make me some kind of hero. Martinez had a baby girl at home. Never got to meet her. Thompson was getting married the next month. Williams was 19, Alexander. 19. The raw pain in Daniel's voice hit Alexander like a physical blow. He sat down on the bench without invitation, close enough to see the old shrapnel scars on Daniel's forearms, the way his breathing became shallow when the memories surfaced. "I read the after-action reports," Alexander said quietly. "You carried Williams half a mile to the evacuation point with a concussion and a broken rib. Wasn't enough." Daniel's voice cracked. "Nothing I did was enough." Emma reached up and touched her father's face with tiny fingers, and Daniel's breathing steadied slightly. The babies had become his anchors, Alexander realized. The reason he fought through the darkness every single day. "Is that why you won't let anyone help you?" Alexander asked. "Because you think you don't deserve it?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching a family of ducks glide across the lake. "I think about them every night. Martinez, Thompson, Williams. They're dead, and I'm here complaining about sleeping on floors and empty bank accounts. What right do I have to want more when they'll never see another sunrise?" Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, a place he'd kept sealed for 3 years. "Can I tell you something?" Daniel nodded, still not meeting his eyes. "I had a daughter, Isabella. She was 7. Alexander's voice caught, but he pushed through. "3 years ago, she was in the car with my wife when a drunk driver ran a red light in downtown Seattle. Rebecca died instantly. Isabella." He paused, gathering strength. "Isabella held on for 6 days. 6 days where I sat by her hospital bed, promising her everything would be okay, using every connection I had to bring in the best doctors, the most advanced treatments." Daniel turned to look at him then, seeing something raw and broken that money couldn't hide. "She died holding my hand," Alexander continued. "And I spent the next 3 years building walls, making money, convincing myself that if I could control enough, own enough, I could somehow control death itself. But the truth is, I stopped living the day she did." The words hung in the air between them, carried by the lake breeze that ruffled Emma's dark hair. "I'm sorry," Daniel said simply, and Alexander knew he meant it in a way that transcended politeness. "The point is," Alexander said, "we both survive things we wish we hadn't. But look around." He gestured to the triplets, who were babbling happily despite their circumstances. "Life keeps insisting on hope, even when we've given up on it." Daniel adjusted Lucas in the stroller, his movements careful and practiced. "Isabella, what was she like?" A smile ghosted across Alexander's face, the first genuine expression Daniel had seen from him. "Stubborn. Brilliant. She wanted to save every stray animal in Manhattan. Used to sneak them into the penthouse and hide them in her room." He paused. "She would have loved your 3. Would have wanted to spoil them rotten. She sounds perfect." She was. Just like Emma, Lucas, and Sophia are perfect. Just like you're a perfect father, even when you're sleeping on floors. Daniel looked down at Emma, who had fallen asleep in his arms, her tiny face peaceful and trusting. "Sometimes I wonder if they'd be better off." "Stop." Alexander's voice was firm. "Don't finish that sentence. I've seen corporate executives who've never changed a diaper in their lives. I've seen parents who hand their children off to nannies and call it love. But I watched you last night, Daniel. The way you positioned yourself between them and the door. The way you woke up every time one of them stirred. That's not survival, that's love in its purest form." For the first time since they'd met, Daniel looked directly into Alexander's eyes. "Why do you care?" "Really?" Alexander considered the question, watching the lake reflect the morning sky. "Because yesterday, for the first time in 3 years, I remembered what it felt like to feel something. And because Isabella would have wanted me to help them. Would have demanded it, actually." Daniel laughed, a sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "Bossy little girl, huh? The bossiest. Got it from her mother." Alexander's smile faded. "I can't bring them back, Daniel. Can't undo Kandahar or Seattle or any of the things that brought us here. But maybe we can honor their memory by making sure these 3 beautiful children don't sleep on floors anymore." Emma stirred in Daniel's arms, making small sounds that indicated feeding time was approaching. Daniel stood, settling her more comfortably. "You really think they'd want this? Your wife and daughter?" Alexander stood too, surprising himself by reaching out to gently touch Sophia's cheek as she slept in the stroller. "I think they'd be furious if we didn't try." As they walked back toward the shelter, Alexander pulled the stroller while Daniel carried Emma. Both men carried their ghosts a little lighter. Behind them, Lake Michigan sparkled with morning promise, and ahead lay the possibility that broken things could be made whole, not by forgetting the past, but by choosing to build something beautiful on its foundation. What's the most powerful way someone has honored a loved one's memory in your life? Share your story in the comments below. The morning light filtering through Alexander's penthouse suite at the Four Seasons cast everything in gold, including Daniel, who sat cross-legged on the Persian rug, watching Emma attempt to grab a silk tassel from one of the throw pillows. 3 weeks had passed since that frozen moment in the shelter, and somehow, impossibly, this had become their routine. "She's going to eat that," Daniel warned, his voice carrying the easy warmth that had developed between them. Gone was the rigid formality of those first awkward days, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to family. Alexander looked up from his laptop, where he'd been pretending to work while actually watching Daniel fold tiny clothes with military precision. "It's a $12,000 pillow." "Then you better hope she has an expensive taste." Daniel's grin transformed his entire face, erasing the shadows that had lived there for so long. "Emma, sweetheart, Uncle Alex is worried about his fancy pillow." Uncle Alex. The name had emerged naturally from Lucas's babbling attempts, but hearing it still sent something warm and unfamiliar through Alexander's chest. He closed the laptop entirely, something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. "I've been thinking," Alexander said, settling beside them on the floor. Lucas immediately reached for his tie, tiny fingers surprisingly strong. "About the Arlington house." Daniel's hands stilled on Sophia's onesie. They'd driven past the Virginia estate twice during their walks, Alexander pointing out features with casual pride while Daniel listened with careful neutrality. 40 rooms, 8 acres, a pool house larger than most people's homes. It had been Alexander's parents' house, then his and Patricia's, then just his after. "It's too big for one person," Alexander continued, his voice carefully measured. "Too empty. But with children." "Alex." Daniel's voice held a warning, the same tone he'd used when Alexander had tried to buy them a car, when he'd attempted to set up trust funds, when his instinct to solve problems with money had crashed against Daniel's pride. "Just think about it." Alexander shifted closer, close enough to smell Daniel's cologne, something inexpensive that he'd somehow grown to prefer over the designer fragrances that filled his bathroom. "The babies would have space to play. There's a garden where they could learn to walk. The school district is excellent." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching Emma finally succeed in grasping the tassel. When she immediately tried to eat it, he gently extracted it from her mouth, replacing it with a proper teething toy. The movement was so naturally paternal, so unconsciously graceful, that Alexander felt his throat tighten. "You know what I realized," Daniel said finally. "I haven't had a nightmare in 2 weeks." Alexander's breath caught. He'd noticed Daniel sleeping more peacefully, the rigid alertness that had marked their early days together gradually softening into something approaching rest. But hearing it confirmed. "The dreams used to come every night," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Kandahar. The explosion that took my unit. I'd wake up screaming, terrifying the babies. But here with you." He looked up and Alexander saw vulnerability so raw it made his chest ache. "I sleep through the night. 8 hours. Can you believe that?" Alexander couldn't speak. In all his years of acquisition and expansion, of building empires and commanding respect, nothing had ever felt as significant as being the reason Daniel Rodriguez could finally rest. "You want to know something?" Alexander's voice came out rougher than intended. "I haven't felt lonely since you've been here." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Emma gurgled happily, oblivious to the weight of the moment, while Lucas discovered the fascinating texture of Alexander's wool sock. Patricia used to say the house felt like a museum, Alexander continued. Beautiful but lifeless. But watching you with the babies, hearing them laugh in rooms that have been silent for 3 years. He paused, struggling with words that had lived locked inside him. It feels like a home again. Daniel reached over, his scarred hand covering Alexander's perfectly manicured one. Alex, I can't be your charity case forever. Is that what you think this is? Alexander turned his palm up, fingers intertwining with Daniel's. Charity. I sleep on your floor because I won't take your bed. I eat your food because my babies need formula. I let you buy them clothes because they were outgrowing everything they owned. Daniel's voice carried the weight of a man who'd spent months cataloging every kindness as debt. I don't know what else to call it. Alexander was quiet for a moment, watching Sophia attempt to roll over on the soft rug. When she succeeded, both men automatically reached to steady her, their hands brushing in the process. 3 months ago, I woke up every morning wondering why I bothered, Alexander said quietly. My company runs itself. My money makes more money. I could disappear tomorrow and the only people who'd notice would be my accountant and my barber. He looked directly at Daniel. But now I wake up wondering if Emma will try solid food today, if Lucas will finally sleep through the night, if Sophia's going to master that crawl she's been working on. Daniel's grip tightened on his hand. Alex. I wake up wondering if you'll still be here. The words came out in a rush, raw and unfiltered. Not in my penthouse, not using my things, but here. With me. Like this. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of the babies exploring their morning world. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice thick with emotion. Those 40 rooms you mentioned, he said. Do any of them have good acoustics for lullabies? Alexander's smile felt like sunrise after the longest night of his life. We'll find out together. What do you think transforms a house into a home? Is it the people inside or the love they share? Tell us about a moment when you realized where you truly belonged. The photographs scattered across Daniel's kitchen table like accusation and evidence combined. Images of him and the triplets at the park, walking through Lincoln Square, even sleeping in what had become their home. Professional shots taken with a telephoto lens, clinical in their invasion, devastating in their implications. Daddy sad. Emma reached from her high chair, tiny fingers grasping toward the envelope that had arrived with Alexander's business card and a note. Documentation for legal proceedings. A. Sterling, CEO. Daniel's hand shook as he gathered the photos, his PTSD symptoms flaring as the familiar sensation of being watched, hunted, targeted crashed over him. The tremor that had quieted during weeks of Alexander's presence returned with vengeance, making the images blur together into a kaleidoscope of betrayal. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of believing that Alexander Sterling saw him as more than a charity case, more than a tax write-off, more than content for whatever sick documentary his money could buy. 3 weeks of watching a billionaire discover joy in midnight feedings, laughter in peekaboo games, purpose in changing diapers that cost more per day than some people earned per hour. 3 weeks of falling in love with the idea that someone like Alexander could love someone like him. The front door opened. Alexander still had the key Daniel had given him, a symbol of trust that now felt like ammunition in enemy hands. Daniel. I brought lunch from that place in Little Italy you. Alexander's voice died as he saw the photographs, saw Daniel's face, saw the wreckage of whatever they'd been building together. Get out. Daniel's voice was military flat, the tone he'd used with insurgents and IEDs and anything else that threatened what he protected. Take your cameras, your documentation, your fucking legal proceedings, and get out of my house. What are you talking about? Alexander moved closer, but Daniel stepped back, putting the kitchen island between them like a barricade. Daniel, what's wrong? What happened? This happened. Daniel slammed one of the photographs onto the counter. Alexander lifting Sophia above his head, both of them laughing, the billionaire's face transformed by genuine joy. Your people have been watching us. Documenting us. For what? Your board of directors? Your PR team? Some heartwarming story about how Alexander Sterling saves the poor veteran and his babies. The color drained from Alexander's face. I don't know anything about photographs. Daniel, you have to believe me. I don't have to believe anything from you. The words came out harsh, shaped by every betrayal Daniel had ever survived. You think I'm stupid? You think 8 years in the army didn't teach me what surveillance looks like? Your lawyers are already building their case, aren't they? Proving the unfit father needs rescuing by the benevolent billionaire. That's not, Daniel, please let me explain. Explain what? That you've been playing house with us while your team gathered evidence? That every moment of the last 3 weeks was just you doing research on your latest acquisition. Alexander's hands reached out, then dropped to his sides as Daniel flinched away from his touch. The gesture, so natural just hours ago when they'd awakened together on the floor with 3 babies between them, now felt like an invasion. You don't understand, Alexander's voice cracked. Yes, I had you investigated initially. Before I knew you, before I understood. Before you understood what? That we're human. That we have feelings. That maybe the poor veteran might actually care about being used as your redemption project. Lucas began crying, sensing the tension, and Daniel moved to comfort him with the automatic grace of 6 months' practice. Alexander started to help, their established rhythm, but Daniel blocked him with his body. Don't touch them. Don't touch my children. The words hit Alexander like physical blows. My children. Not our routine, not the babies we care for together, not the family unit they'd begun to imagine. The distance Daniel created was measured in more than feet. It was continental, oceanic, final. Daniel, please. Let me show you what those photos really are. They're not for lawyers or PR or anything sinister. They're. Alexander's voice broke completely. They're for me. I asked my security team to document us because I've never been happy before, and I wanted to remember what it looked like. Liar. But Daniel's voice wavered, uncertainty creeping in despite his rage. I have a safe in my bedroom with hundreds of photos of Sarah and Emma, my wife and daughter who died. I look at them every night and try to remember their voices, their smell, the way Sarah used to steal my coffee in the mornings. I was terrified I'd forget what happiness felt like with you and the babies, so I documented it like some pathetic. Stop. Daniel's voice was raw. Just stop. I can't do this. I can't be your replacement family, your second chance, your fucking charity case disguised as love. Sophia started crying now, then Emma. 3 babies feeding off the emotional devastation filling their small sanctuary. Alexander stepped forward instinctively to help, but Daniel's voice stopped him cold. I said don't touch them. Matter of fact, don't come back. Whatever this was, whatever I thought this was, it's over. Take your money, your guilt, your need to save somebody, and find another broken family to fix. Alexander stood frozen in the doorway of what had become the closest thing to home he'd known in 3 years, watching Daniel comfort 3 children who had started to feel like his own, seeing the man he'd fallen in love with disappear behind walls of pride and pain that his money had built. Daniel. Get out, Alexander. And take your key. The small piece of metal landed on the counter with a sound like shattering, and Alexander Sterling, who had conquered markets and built empires and survived losses that would have destroyed weaker men, discovered that there were some things his billions couldn't buy back once they were broken. He left without another word, because sometimes love means knowing when to stop fighting, even when surrender feels like death. Behind him, Daniel collapsed onto the floor with 3 crying babies, whispering the only promise he had left. Daddy's got you. Daddy's always got you. Even when Daddy was falling apart. The Chicago Tribune building cast long shadows across Michigan Avenue as Daniel Rodriguez sat on a bench outside the federal courthouse, holding the crumpled business card that had become both his lifeline and his burden. 3 days had passed since he'd walked away from Alexander's penthouse. 3 days of sleeping in the shelter with Emma, Lucas, and Sophia pressed against his chest, their tiny breaths the only thing keeping his shattered heart beating. The morning sun felt cold against his face, nothing like the Arizona warmth he'd left behind. His phone, a prepaid piece of plastic that barely held a charge, sat silent in his palm. Alexander's number was programmed in, but his thumb hovered over the delete button like a soldier over a landmine. Pride had always been his armor. In Kandahar, when shrapnel tore through his shoulder, he'd refused morphine until every man in his unit was treated first. When Maria walked out on their newborn triplets, he'd told himself he was better off alone. When the eviction notices piled up, he'd worked 3 jobs rather than ask for help. Pride had kept him standing when everything else fell apart. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Inside the courthouse, he'd just finished signing papers that would grant Alexander temporary guardianship if something happened to him. A legal safety net that felt like surrender and salvation wrapped in bureaucratic red tape. The social worker had been kind, understanding, but her words echoed like gunfire in his mind. These babies need stability, Mr. Rodriguez. If you can't provide it. He thought about Alexander's face 3 nights ago, the way those steel-gray eyes had cracked when Daniel accused him of playing house with someone else's pain. The billionaire had reached out, voice breaking. Daniel, please, you don't understand. But Daniel had already been walking away, babies in his arms, pride bleeding from a wound he'd inflicted on them both. Now, sitting on this bench where Chicago's morning rush flowed around him like he was invisible, Daniel finally understood what his drill sergeant had tried to teach him 20 years ago. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is surrender. His phone buzzed. A text from Tony in Phoenix. Heard about a job opening at the VA hospital. Night security. Pays decent. You coming home? Home. Phoenix felt like another lifetime, another man's story. But Chicago. Chicago held the memory of Alexander's laugh when Sophia grabbed his finger, the sight of a billionaire learning to change diapers like his life depended on it, the sound of someone saying, "I love you" to his children like they were precious beyond measure. Daniel's thumb moved to Alexander's contact, then stopped. What if he'd been wrong? What if walking away had been the coward's choice, not the noble one? 3 miles north, Alexander Sterling stood at the window of his hotel suite, watching the same sunrise paint the city in shades of amber and regret. His laptop displayed 17 urgent emails from his board of directors, each one demanding answers about his sudden absence from Sterling Industries. Stock prices fluctuated. Deals stalled. His empire continued its relentless march forward while its emperor stood frozen in grief. But for the first time in 3 years, the empire felt small compared to what he'd lost. The hotel suite was pristine, expensive, empty. Everything his life had been before Daniel and the triplets crashed into it like a meteor through his carefully constructed atmosphere. Room service breakfast sat untouched on the table. His phone charged silently, filled with messages he couldn't bring himself to read. Except one. Daniel's contact information glowed on the screen like a beacon. Alexander had typed and deleted a dozen messages. "I'm sorry. Too simple. Please come back. Too desperate. I need you. Too honest." His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized. Hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, eyes red from sleepless nights spent remembering the weight of Emma in his arms, the sound of Lucas's laughter, the way Sophia had looked at him like he hung the moon. And Daniel. God, Daniel, who'd given him purpose when he thought he'd lost it forever. The acquisition papers for the shelter lay scattered on his desk, and signed and forgotten. Profit margins and tax benefits seemed obscene now, mathematical abstractions compared to the reality of what those buildings represented. Sanctuary for people like Daniel, who'd served their country and received pink slips in return. Alexander's phone rang. His CFO. "Sir, the board is getting restless. The Matthews deal needs your signature, and there are questions about your extended absence." "Cancel it," Alexander said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Sir, cancel the acquisition. All of it. And schedule a board meeting for next week. I have some changes to announce." He hung up before his CFO could respond, then immediately dialed another number. Sterling Foundation came from the professional voice of his charitable organization's director, an entity he'd created for tax purposes and largely ignored. "Patricia, it's Alexander. I need you to draft papers for a new initiative. Housing assistance for veterans. Childcare support. Job training programs. I want it operational within the month." "Mr. Sterling, that's wonderful, but the funding will come from my personal accounts. Whatever it takes." As he spoke, outlining programs that would have horrified his board but felt like breathing after years of suffocation, Alexander caught sight of something that made his heart stop. Across the street, on a bench outside the courthouse, a familiar figure sat hunched over a phone. Daniel. Alexander's hand shook as he ended the call with Patricia. Through 17 floors of glass and steel, across a river of morning traffic, 2 broken men sat with the same decision trembling in their hands. Reach out, or let pride bury love forever. The choice had never been simpler or more terrifying. Alexander Sterling, who'd built an empire on calculated risks, took the greatest gamble of his life. He pressed the call. 1 ring. 2. 3. On a bench 17 floors below, Daniel Rodriguez looked at his buzzing phone, saw Alexander's name, and chose courage over pride. "Hello, Alex." "Daniel." The name came out like a prayer. "I'm looking out my window and I think we need to stop running from each other." Through tears neither man would admit to shedding, across a distance measured in heartbeats rather than city blocks, 2 souls reached for each other with shaking hands and whispered the words that would change everything. "I'm sorry. I love you too." The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's Chicago penthouse, the one he'd bought instead of returning to Manhattan, painted everything in gold. Daniel stood at the same windows where Alexander had once stared at the city below, but now he wasn't looking down at Chicago. He was watching 3 toddlers chase each other around a living room that had been transformed from a sterile showcase into something that actually resembled a home. Emma squealed with delight as she stumbled toward the couch, her chubby legs still mastering the art of walking. Lucas followed close behind, babbling in a language only siblings understand, while Sophia sat content in Alexander's lap, tiny fingers exploring the texture of his weekend sweater. Cashmere that cost more than Daniel's old monthly rent, now decorated with cheerful stains of mashed banana and finger paint. "She's got your eyes," Alexander murmured, adjusting Sophia so she could better see her siblings' impromptu game of tag. "All three of them do. That fire, that determination." Daniel settled beside them on the couch, Italian leather that had been selected by designers but broken in by babies learning to crawl. "They've got something else too," he said, watching as Emma took a tumble and immediately got back up undeterred. "They've got hope. Real hope, not the kind I had to manufacture every morning just to get through another day." The penthouse bore little resemblance to the cold monument Alexander had once called home. Toys scattered across Persian rugs worth more than cars. Children's books stacked on tables that had previously held only financial reports. Crayon drawings taped to walls where museum-quality art had once hung in lonely perfection. But the most dramatic change wasn't in the decor. It was in the man holding Sophia, the way his shoulders had relaxed, how his eyes crinkled when the babies laughed, the unconscious smile that played at his lips when he watched them discover the world. "I keep thinking about that first night," Alexander said, his voice soft with memory. "When I walked into that shelter and saw you on that floor with them. I was so angry at first. Angry at you for being there, angry at the world for allowing it, angry at myself for never seeing it before." Daniel nodded, understanding in ways that went beyond words. "I was angry too. Angry that you got to see us like that, angry that I needed help, angry that I couldn't give them what they deserved on my own." He paused, watching Lucas attempt to stack blocks into an impossibly tall tower. But maybe that's what needed to happen. Maybe we both needed to be broken down before we could build something real. The sound of a key in the lock interrupted the moment, followed by familiar voices in the foyer. Maria, Daniel's sister from Phoenix, arrived with Tony and their kids for Sunday brunch, a weekly tradition that had evolved from Alexander's initial awkwardness with family gatherings into genuine joy at having a house full of laughter. Uncle Alex. Tony's 7-year-old daughter Carmen launched herself at Alexander, who caught her with the ease of practice. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have known how to hold a child. Now he was a jungle gym, a storyteller, a co-conspirator in elaborate games involving imaginary dragons and very real ice cream. "How are my favorite troublemakers?" Maria asked, scooping up Lucas while kissing Daniel's cheek. She'd been skeptical at first, protective of her brother who'd been through too much, but Alexander's patient, consistent presence had won her over completely. As the morning unfolded into the comfortable chaos of extended family, Alexander found himself in the kitchen with Daniel, both men working in comfortable synchronization to prepare food for their unconventional clan. It was a scene that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months ago. A billionaire and a veteran, standing side by side, arguing good-naturedly about whether the pancakes needed more blueberries. "The adoption papers came through yesterday," Alexander said quietly, not wanting to overshadow the moment but needing Daniel to know. "It's official. I'm their legal guardian too now." Daniel's hands stilled on the mixing bowl. They'd talked about this step for months, working through the legal complexities, the emotional implications, the practical realities of two men from completely different worlds choosing to build a family together. "Are you sure? I mean, really sure? Because once those papers are signed..." "Daniel." Alexander turned to face him fully, flour dusting his expensive sweater, his hair mussed from Carmen's enthusiastic hugs. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You and Emma and Lucas and Sophia, you're my family. My choice, my future, my everything." From the living room came the sound of Emma's delighted giggle as she successfully knocked down Lucas's block tower. followed by his indignant protest and Sophia's sympathetic babbling. It was the soundtrack of home, the music Alexander had never known he was missing. "I love you too," Daniel said simply, the words carrying the weight of gratitude, hope, and a future neither of them could have imagined. "All of us do." Later that evening, after Maria and Tony had returned to their hotel, after the babies were fed and bathed and tucked into cribs that now occupied the master bedroom's adjoining nursery, Daniel and Alexander sat together on their couch, surrounded by the beautiful debris of a day well lived. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," Daniel admitted, his head resting on Alexander's shoulder. "That this is all some dream I'm having back on that shelter floor, and reality is going to crash back in." "Then we'll dream it together," Alexander replied, pressing a kiss to Daniel's temple. "And if it is a dream, then I never want to wake up." Outside their windows, Chicago sparkled in the darkness, a city full of possibilities and second chances. Inside their home, 3 babies slept peacefully, safe and loved and surrounded by abundance that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the 2 men who had chosen each other, chosen love over fear. The veteran who had once slept on cold floors now rested in warmth. The billionaire who had once been frozen in isolation now moved through life with purpose. And 3 innocent souls who had entered the world with nothing but need had become the bridge between 2 hearts, the miracle that transformed strangers into family, the proof that love, real, lasting, transformative love, always finds a way. Looking at Daniel and Alexander's journey from that frozen moment to this beautiful family, what does this story teach you about how love can transform the most impossible situations? Share in the comments what moment of unexpected connection changed your life forever. Single dad veteran slept on the floor with triplet babies. The billionaire walked in and froze. A story of love transcending all barriers, set against the backdrop of American cities from Phoenix to Manhattan to Chicago, proving that sometimes the most broken people create the most beautiful families. Thanks for sticking with this story till the very end. But trust me, you haven't seen anything yet. The next story is crazier, more shocking, and will blow your mind. Click the image on your screen now and dive right in. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a single twist.